We as young Zimbabweans must live lives filled with opportunity, filled with possibility, that advance our capabilities and that are dignifying. We cannot live somewhat of a life. We have to live good lives. And with the current tax regime, with the current soaring of prices, a lot of businesses are shutting down. It is clear that whatever is there right now was not doing a good job. I simply cannot understand why it wants to extend its stay if it was not doing a good job. So we have to be very intentional and deliberate about the future we're building. We have to be very intentional and deliberate about our demands. And we also have to be intentional and deliberate about the kind of governance arrangement that we encourage.
A very good morning to you guys. Welcome to Ansake Online. My name is Brighton Ncube. This is the CITE View, a show that seeks to look at politics and current affairs and everything happening in our various communities. Over the past few weeks, there's been a talk around the issue of the 2030 mantra. Newspaper articles have been banging and also raising different issues around 2030 mantra. Politicians have endorsed that, different provinces have endorsed that, and there's been a debate like in terms of the 2030 mantra, what would be done to achieve that, and many debate and people speaking their views about those who are against it and those who are supporting it. And today, I want to hear the perspective of young people, a young person who's a Pan-Africanist, is an activist, is a feminist, is also a constitutionalist, is also a youth leader. She leads WELEAD Trust as the executive director there. That's Namatai Kwekweza. Today, Namatai, I want to hear from you in terms of, as a young leader in Zimbabwe, as a female as well, what do you think about the 2030 mantra? Over to you, ma'am, as the platform to you to speak to us about the 2030 mantra. What does it mean to you and to young people in Zimbabwe?
All right, so thank you very much, Brighton, for inviting me to have a conversation with young people about the 2030 mantra that we have seen making waves in recent times. So to start with, I just wanted to say that the idea of good governance and democracy and constitutionalism, the battle really for all of those things has been ongoing for such a long period of time. And we must be cognizant of the fact that young people have in the past developed a consciousness to be able to make critical inquisitions into whatever the current arrangements that are being made by the older generation in terms of our democracy, our governance, but also our constitution. The critical question into, are these arrangements good for us? Are they good for us legally? Are they good for us politically? Are they good for us when we measure them through the human rights test? And are they also good for us in terms of our future? And I think this conversation about the 2030 mantra is something that we must have cognizant of history. So I would just start by saying that, this would not be the first time in Zimbabwe where a head of state has made an effort towards changing the constitution to prolong their stay in power. We saw this with Robert Mugabe, who, by the way, ended up amending the constitution of Zimbabwe a total of about 17 times throughout his reign to consolidate his power, to extend his stay in power. And some of these amendments that he was making were not directly around the term limit. They were around things that supported him in power, maybe attacking the judiciary or going after parliament. Or different state institutions that he felt were getting in the way. So he was consistently making these amendments to prolong his stay in power. And that is something that in Africa has come to be known as a constitutional coup, where basically you start making changes in the constitution to ensure that you can prolong your stay in power, to legalize something that is purely undemocratic, to legalize something that is clearly unjust, to legalize something that violates human rights and that violates the will and the choices of the people. So now we fast track that into the period we are in. And we start in 2013 when we drafted this new constitution. Remember, we had been using the Lancaster House constitution, the Lancaster Constitution that came about soon after independence. And finally, in 2013, there had been an ongoing outcry for a new constitution. And there was this creation of this new constitution of 2013, Amendment number 20, that we now use to this very day. And after that particular process, it is a process where there was a referendum of about 3.3 million Zimbabweans who voted yes. to this particular constitution, which was a 96% endorsement. So only about 4% of people were against it. 96% of the 3.3 million Zimbabweans who voted for that constitution were in affirmation, were supporting the idea that this was a new constitution. And of course, it came with its pros and cons. It came with its upsides and downsides. But the general belief by so many people in so many different places was that it was a good constitution. And then we will fast track it to 2017, after the coup, where we saw the first attempt to make an amendment to the Constitution via Constitutional Amendment Bill number 1. And this Constitutional Amendment Bill number 1 basically targeted the judiciary. And it was eventually passed after they went through a lot of technical issues, a lot of legal, very administrative technical issues that had to be fixed. It was sent back a couple of times until finally it was said that the technical administrative issues had been fixed and it was eventually passed. But this is something that really went against the judiciary, was weakening the judiciary. We fast track it to 2019, where we saw the introduction of Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2. And this one was a very contested one because it had so many amendments, including consequential amendments. And the perhaps political thing that was done by the current government was to introduce that particular proposal to amend the Constitution, which was attacking again the judiciary, which was removing a public process where the public would have a say in who was to become a judge. It was also extending the retirement ages for judges to allow persons like Malaba to extend their stay in their roles. Malaba is the Chief Justice who also endorsed the very much contested 2018 elections. So there were all these things that were very problematic. But it also had these things that people thought were progressive, like the introduction of a 10-seat quota system and the extension of the 60-seat quota system for women. And it was said to the public that you would either take the amendments as they were and get the good stuff and also the not so good stuff that came with it, or you would basically shun it completely and refuse to take that particular amendment, refuse the bad stuff, but also refuse the good stuff with it. So, this is something that was heavily contested, and we saw a lot of people getting arrested. We saw a lot of issues cropping up with Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2, and eventually it was passed into law. Hence, we do have the quota system, we do have the women's quota, but also a lot of the draconian things that had been suggested, the bad stuff, also came with that particular amendment. Now, we are at a time when we have seen this resurgence of this conversation around amending the Constitution. There is a strong appetite for it. And of course, there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation, a lot of political rhetoric and political lingo coming in from different places. And I just wanted to encourage young people that you must not be drawn away, distracted by the political lingo, but you must understand what the proposal of the amendment of the Constitution to extend a term limit means for you at a very deep and personal level, means to you in your everyday life, means to you for your future. And I think this is the point upon which we must have this conversation. I would like to say that in the past, I've had issues with how these conversations about the Constitution being amended are held in such a very legal, very procedural manner, instead of us having them as conversations that are more substantive and are focusing on the day-to-day lived experiences of the everyday ordinary Zimbabwean who has to bear the full brunt of what it means to live in a country where there's bad governance. So, you look at the conversation. I've had different people, different political players. You talk about the main leader of the opposition, Nelson Chamisa. He denounced that, these amendments must be made. You talk about people like Douglas Munzora. Again, they have, resurged and have come to say that they don't want the amendments to be made. You also have people like Professor Maduku. I remember listening to him recently in a video where he was saying that, the president at the moment has not said that he wants to amend the Constitution. It's not something that he said, and that there are people that benefit politically from that narrative who are saying that. So we've had all these different political voices from these different angles. But today I can only speak for me and as a young person, and I can only speak about what would be the right response for a young person legally, for a young person politically, for a young person from a human rights perspective, and for a young person who thinks about the future of this country. So it is important for us to say that this talk about a third term is coming from somewhere. And even prior to 2024-2025 period, there had been talk within the Women's League of ZANU-PF, but also within the Youth League of ZANU-PF, that they wanted to amend the constitution to extend the presidential term limits. Now, why I as a young person have a problem with amending the constitution to extend the presidential term limit is that we already as young people constitute a demographic majority, and we are participating in a process of encouraging the amendment of the constitution to maintain an old man in power, literally to extend his stay in power, when young people still who are the majority are underrepresented at every level of society. And this is very problematic. We know that the constitution in section 20, it talks about youth rights. In section 56, it talks about non-discrimination, including on the basis of age. And yet the constitution still says that for you to be president, for you to be a commissioner, for you to be a judge, you'd have to be 40 and above. So why should young people support a process that does not in any way benefit the demographic majority? And that's the first question we need to be asking ourselves, because we are constitutionally excluded, which by the way is unconstitutional, because section 56 is clear that we shouldn't be discriminated upon the basis of our age. And this is something that we have to think about. The next thing that we have to think about is the legal proceedings that are bound to follow for the amendment of the constitution will be extremely clandestine. And we have seen this in the past, where it's a very wishy-washy process. It's a very rushed, fast-tracked process. And typically, how the constitution was designed in 2013 was that if the current sitting president wanted to amend the constitution to get an extension in this particular agenda of 2030, they would not be the immediate beneficiaries. It would be the next leader who would benefit from that. And it also said that for that particular amendment to sell through, it had to go through a referendum, which means that people have to vote like what they did in 2013. And that process of going through a referendum will be a very, very difficult process because of the amount of appetite that exists to amend this particular clause to allow this current president to proceed and to stay in power. And it would be a very hectic process in the sense that he would do practically anything to stay in power. And we might actually be looking into a very violent contested period, a clash of power, if you could say that. The next thing we also have to consider is the conversation about the forces at play. We understand that within ZANU-PF circles, there are factions, with, of course, the faction of the president and, of course, the faction of Chiwenga, the vice president and former military general. And I think we have to consider this in our conversation to say that as young people, if we support the 2030 mantra, we could be just playing politics between these two titans, and pretty much that's none of our business. Our focus must be on who within our leadership, within the confines of our current existing constitution, within the confines of what we believe to be a democratic society, can give Zimbabweans, and especially young Zimbabweans, a good, prosperous life filled with possibility and opportunity. And this idea of saying, I want to extend my stay until 2030 so I can finish my projects, so I can do this and that. What project can they finish that they could not finish in the past 10 years? What project can they do that can improve the lives of Zimbabweans that they could not do in the past 10 years? The next thing we have to have a critical conversation about is the conversation around our lived experiences since 2017. We have to actually analyze our lives. To analyze our lives using Chapter 4 of the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights, which talks about our right to education, which talks about, and these are basic human rights, by the way, our right to food, our right to healthcare, our right to shelter, our right to access clean drinking water. You know, we're talking about the very basics, our freedoms from torture, freedoms from prolonged pretrial detention, freedoms from cruel and inhumane treatment, freedoms from abductions, freedom of expression. All of these are rights, political, socioeconomic rights that we find in the Constitution. When we make an imposition into the current president to say from 2017 until now, Have they delivered on that promise, that constitutional promise, that every Zimbabwean must have those rights? And they have not. They have not in so many constituencies, in so many urban areas. The hospitals are dysfunctional. Are we saying that we want to extend that to 2030 and something different can come out of it? So I always encourage young people to think about this way, that the past always tells us the truth. These people have a track record. In the past, when they were given the opportunity and the moment to do something, did they actually do something that guarantees that they can extend their stay in power, which is something that does not benefit the citizens? The last thing that I want to just talk about on these issues before I wrap it up is this conversation around corruption. If you look at all of these fundamental rights that they have failed to deliver on, the right to education, the right to healthcare, and in particularly the right to healthcare, because we saw in the COVID-19 era just how much of the resources that we got from international institutions to fight COVID, and most of those resources went into the pockets of political elites. A clear indication that there is no consciousness to say if people live or die, we don't care. There is absolutely no consciousness in that respect. You look at issues around the water crisis, our water rights. In urban areas, people are getting water from Jiborani, in 2024 and 2025. These are the lived realities of people in Zimbabwe, right? We look at all these issues around education. How many young people are dropping out of universities, are dropping out of high school because their parents cannot afford to send them to school anymore? Their parents are civil servants. How many young people are going through that? We make a critical inquisition into where does the money go. We've had numerous scandals from the gold mafia. We've had numerous scandals from the issue of the 15 billion, of course, that's in the previous dispensation. We've had even in recent times the issue of the goats, all of this money that is illicitly being taken away from citizens that can really, really help to make our lives better. And those people still want more time in public office leadership. I think it's high time that we as young people make that critical inquisition and critical analysis. And from that premise say, no matter who you are, no matter how good you are, and this is something that Barack Obama said when he left office, that, if I wanted to run for another term, the people of America would have still wanted me to run for another term. But because the Constitution of the United States is clear that my time has come, it has went, I was a good leader, it's done. When it's your time to go, it is your time to go. However, I will end with this issue. This is my next point on the future. We as young people in Zimbabwe must be very intentional about the future we want to build. For in rejecting the amendment of the Constitution, in rejecting the 2030 mantra, we are in essence creating a vacuum, and that has to be filled by something. Us rejecting the 2030 mantra is not us endorsing Chiwenga. Us rejecting the 2030 mantra is not us endorsing the opposition. Us rejecting the 2030 mantra is us rejecting poverty, is us rejecting unconstitutionalism. It is us rejecting injustice, inequality. It is us rejecting living lives with no quality healthcare, with no quality access to food and water. At some point in 2019, 2020, the World Food Program was saying that more than half of the Zimbabwean population was in dire need of food aid. And when you think about how Trump and American money, which was also supporting programs like the World Food Program and the World Health Organization, I hear they've cut funding from that as well. They're not there to help us anymore. We, as the people of this country, and particularly young people who constitute the demographic majority, must begin to demand leaders that will ensure that we have good quality lives, that we have lives filled with opportunity and possibility. So when we are painting a vision of the future, we must be very cognizant of the fact that we have within ourselves a power to reject what it is that we don't want, but to be intentional about what it is that we want. And what it is that we want is good governance. What it is that we want is our rights respected. What it is that we want is a future filled with possibility. To close it off, Brighton, I wanted just to say to every young people listening, I'm a human rights activist, human rights defender. And the reason why I wake up every day to fight for human rights is because I understand fully well that no young person, no young female, no young person with disability, no young person in a rural area can live to the heights of their potential, their capabilities, their possibilities, if they're living in environments where their rights are consistently violated. If you're living in environments where your right to access clean water, your right to access good quality healthcare, there are people who have lost loved ones in public hospitals because they simply didn't have a catheter, something as simple as a catheter to help people breathe. They didn't have that. You know, if you're living in an environment where your right to education is consistently denied, you cannot reach the heights of your potential and your possibility. We as young Zimbabweans must live lives filled with opportunity, filled with possibility, that advance our capabilities and that are dignifying. We cannot live somewhat of a life. We have to live good lives. And with the current tax regime, with the current soaring of prices, a lot of businesses are shutting down. It is clear that whatever is there right now was not doing a good job. And I simply cannot understand why it wants to extend its stay if it was not doing a good job. So we have to be very intentional and deliberate about the future we're building. We have to be very intentional and deliberate about our demands. And we also have to be intentional and deliberate about the kind of governance arrangement that we encourage. If the 2030 agenda sells through, and I know a motion has already been drafted by Motodi, a draft motion that was leaked on social media. So there is appetite for it, there is intention. We've not seen something official as of yet. But if there is going to be an amendment of the Constitution to extend the stay of the president, who is creating a dynasty, who is accumulating wealth for him and his family, who wants to extend his stay in power to protect all the wealth, all the loot that they have gotten over the years at our expense as citizens. If that sells through, then we as Zimbabweans would have set a precedent that more and more things like that will happen in the future. So this is our political moment as young people to protect the Constitution and to tell our leaders who the true bosses of this country are. And the true bosses of this country, it is you and me, it is us, the people. Thank you so much, Brighton, for allowing me this opportunity to speak with young people.
That was the voice of Namatai Kwekweza. They're speaking to us, young people, the entire country, about the 2030 mantra. Hope you guys enjoyed the show, enjoyed the discussion, speaking highly about the constitution of Zimbabwe and what it means to young people in terms of rule of law and in terms of 2030 mantra, if this goes through, what it means to us and what young people want in terms of the constitution of Zimbabwe and also in terms of livelihoods. Thanks so much for tuning in this morning. Thanks so much, Namatai, for your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Brighton, for having me, and let's do this again sometime.
Thank you.